Good evening and welcome, fans, to another edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast. I'm Jack Kilby, your host, and tonight we have a very special guest. That is Devin Nicholson to mark his 40th birthday. We'll be taking fan questions and also getting to some of the information that fans want to know about his career. Devin, welcome very much.
Yes, I wasn't planning on doing it, but apparently Nova, who you had booked, decided to not do the podcast that she had planned. So I decided to jump in last minute, and the fans have been wanting me to do a Q&A with Piper for a while. Piper's still tired from a little cameo she had in a movie yesterday. But why not? You fans have given me a great job working as a reporter for YouTube, talking to wrestling legends that I grew up idolizing as a job. So what better way to celebrate my birthday than with you guys? And by the way, there have been some fans that have been nice enough to ask how to tip me. You could tip me the YouTube way, which YouTube takes 30%. Or if you really want to tip me for my birthday, right above my head there's a PayPal QR code. You could just use that. And if you just want to watch, that's fine. But for the fans that have asked, I figured I'd put up the QR code because that's the easiest way. So I'll let you get on to your questions. And we will take fan questions as well. Thank you, everyone. I'm still here. I was just taking myself out of the screen while you asked your question.
All good. I think most fans would like to know what it was that first sparked your interest in the professional wrestling industry.
Well, first I'll say thanks to Mike and Matt for wishing me happy birthday. I do appreciate that. And my mother was a stay-at-home mom mostly. She also babysat kids. And when I was a baby, I was adopted, but my parents got me when I was 6 months old. Wrestling was very popular in the 80s. And eventually around when I was about 3 or 4, my mom started to babysit one kid. And this kid was about 4 or 5 years older than me and was a fanatic wrestling fan. So pretty much as I was able to talk and communicate, I had this kid drilling all this wrestling information into me. So it was kind of natural that I become a wrestling fan. And then shortly after that, I went to my first live event, which was Macho Man against Brutus Beefcake in the main event at the Ottawa Civic Center. And I was hooked. That I already knew that was what I wanted to do, because in those days, I guess a lot of people had video games, but my parents didn't get me video games until I was in about grade 3 or 4. We would go outside and wrestle or play tag or play hide and go seek. So I was wrestling from a young age. And I actually think going outside and the neighborhood kids would all wrestle and be WWE wrestlers in those days. I think actually those doing that almost on a nightly basis for most of my childhood prepared me very well for amateur wrestling, which I ended up getting into, because even though I didn't really know what I was doing, I got used to the balance and stuff. And like sometimes there'd be older kids that would, even though we were playing WWE wrestling, we would wrestle for real. So it got you used to those situations where you'd be grappling and wrestling with people.
The question also that is an adjunct to that is, I know you trained under Jacques Rougeau, and that's been covered. But do you have any memories of your first bookings and your first matches that you worked? How were you being a a very proficient athlete, I'm sure that came with a level of confidence that maybe some other people did not have. But what were your first experiences when you actually got in the ring in front of a crowd to work a match?
Well, I had actually started with Matt Rats, which was Eric Bischoff's company with Jason Hervey, which nothing really ever came out of that. And I moved out to Calgary, turned down amateur wrestling scholarships to train for that Matt Rat show, which Natty Neidhart was part of, Ted Hart, Randy Myers, Rick Victor, who went on to WWE, Jack Evans was in it, Rene Dupree. So I kind of got the wrestling bug there, but we were supposed to get paid out of that show, and we were never actually paid. So when I first moved out there, I didn't quite have enough to live longer than 4 months. So I kind of went broke. Couldn't sustain living out in Calgary by myself, and decided I would come back to stay with my parents in Ottawa and save up money to go back to Calgary and actually train at the dungeon, which at the time was 3,000 American, plus obviously you'd have to live out there. So I really only trained with Jacques Rougeau about a year, and at that time he was only doing 2 events a year, and all the training was practicing your match for the event. So it wasn't teaching you how to call matches on the fly. You were learning how to wrestle, and I always say he helped with the showmanship side. But I got a rude awakening when I went back to visit Calgary about 2 or 3 months before I ended up moving back there, because by this time I've been training with Jacques Rougeau about 8 months. And at the time, someone was putting on a Stampede wrestling show at his college, and it was only in front of about 50 people, and there was only 3 matches. But because there was 3 matches, I was asked to go out and have this 20-minute call on the fly match with a veteran who quickly found out that I had no idea how to call a match on the fly, and basically beat the crap out of me in a working manner for 20 minutes. And now I didn't know, looking back, I know he beat the crap out of me, but back then I didn't understand or know enough about wrestling that he was actually taking liberties with me and roughing me up. I was still like ecstatic to be wrestling, but I did realize in that match, because at the time I did keep a girlfriend in Calgary that came to see me there, and we were both like, man, you've been training for 8 months and you cannot call a match on the fly. So it was at that point where I basically stayed for the Jacques Rougeau December show. I believe that was in like late October, early November. And then I think it was just after New Year's Eve, because I remember I worked my bouncing job New Year's Eve, and a couple days later I drove to Calgary, where I then trained full-time with Bruce Hart and Ross Hart. And at that time, Stampede Wrestling was doing 4 to 6 events a month on a much smaller scale than Jacques. Jacques only did 2, but he had like 3,000 to 5,000 people at the shows. At this time in Stampede Wrestling, there could be, some of those events was 40 people a good night. I mean, at one point I started promoting the Stampede Wrestling shows out of town, and I remember at one point I had like 400 at a show where I brought some stars in for, and that was like a record for Stampede. So overall, it was very small crowds, other than certain shows. I know they did a Stu Hart's 88th birthday show that had about 500 or 600 as well in there. But overall, I think the family was doing it more or less to give Harry, Tyson Kidd, and Ted and Natty experience, because they weren't certainly making a lot of money at that time.
Friend of the show, King of Connecticut, wanted to know who your favorite heel was besides the King, of course.
I always liked the heels better, and Macho Man was my favorite when I was young, and then later Ric Flair, once Ric Flair came to WWE, because at those times in Canada, we didn't get much NWA. So you would see Ric Flair on the tape, but when Ric Flair he actually made his WWE debut right in Ottawa. For those that don't know, September 9th, 1991, that whole thing where he attacked Piper and hit Vince McMahon with a chair at the commentator's booth, that was actually in the Ottawa Civic Center. And that was back in the days where they were taping 3 or 4 television shows at once. So he had several matches on that card too. So I was there that night, and Ric Flair, once I was exposed to him, he kind of eclipsed my love of Macho Man. But I remember I was a huge Macho Man fan growing up, and when I would put on backyard wrestling matches, which I started doing when I was like 5 or 6 years old, I would be the Macho Man. And there is pictures in existence of me dressing like him and stuff. And ultimately, when he passed away in 2011, his brother Lanny Poffo gave me permission to run the only official Macho Man Randy Savage memorial show, which we did in Hawkesbury, Ontario with Great North Wrestling, and had 1,300 fans there. So I was quite honored about that. And of course, I was in a feature match on that card. Lanny Poffo won the Battle Royal in the main event to become the first ever Great North Wrestling champion. He was supposed to wrestle Greg Valentine, but Greg Valentine famously no-showed. But and he never did return us our money from that either. But I was still honored to put on that event.
King sent a follow-up there in terms of, do you have any reflection on wrestling his good friend and legend both in MMA and pro wrestling, Dan Severn?
Yes, and that match I think has about 50 or 60,000 views online. What I remember from Dan Severn is I'm known for chopping very hard. And what I remember about Dan Severn is a lot of wrestlers will take one chop and like cover up or try and avoid a chop. I remember Abdullah once sticking a fork up when I tried to chop him, or like get very mad or almost run away when you chop. And I just remember Dan Severn like just taking the chops like they were nothing. It was like just chopping a punching bag. He was thick, and I knew it wasn't bothering him. And it was just nice to have that, because it's rare in wrestling where you'll have someone that'll be like, yeah, just chop me as much as you want. I don't care.
We have a preemptive question of one that I was going to ask you from Andrew, who says, what was it like wrestling and living in Puerto Rico? Is it as dangerous there as everyone says it is? And were you ever in a situation where you felt your life was in danger?
By 2005 to 2008, when I was wrestling in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico was still a dangerous place. I had a friend there that was a police officer who told me it wasn't uncommon to have 19 murders in a weekend in Puerto Rico. And in Puerto Rico, I think there were only about 3 or 4 million total on the island. So you would see people with guns. You knew that the police were making very little money, and you heard there was a lot of corruption. But other than the fans were passionate, and the people that ran in IWA anyways, because when I was in IWA Puerto Rico, they took it more seriously. They actually paid their wrestlers what they said they were going to pay, and they paid on time. And I guess because of that, and they were having good crowds. It wasn't uncommon to have 5,000 or 7,000 people at an event back in those days. You were expected to always kayfabe. So if you were a heel, you wouldn't want to be seen talking to fans outside the arenas in between matches or anything. Or if if let's say it was always heels usually for the Americans, so we would drive together. But let's just say they flew in somebody that was a star, like X Pac, for instance, came once for a few shows that was a babyface. He would have to be let out before we got out of the van. So we'd have to let him out further away from the arena. And they would tell us to all duck our heads down in the van when he was coming out, just in case any fans were looking when he was getting out of the van, so they wouldn't see the heels with him. But yeah, there was it was a dangerous island, but looking back, I really enjoyed my time there. I actually had a Puerto Rican fiance that just it fell apart because business died in Puerto Rico, and I came back to Canada, and we just broke. We ended up breaking up, but when the whole time I was there, her and I had a very good relationship, and like other than WWC Puerto Rico, where they stiffed you on your pay a lot, which caused a lot of stress. Because by that time, I actually had my own place with her as well. Whereas not at IWA, they were paying for me to have an apartment with another one of the wrestlers. It was fun overall because you'd only wrestle 4 days a week, and all the drives were short. So you could wake up at like 11, go to the gym, have a big meal, leisurely drive to the arena, have your match, and then come home, have another big meal. And it was just a very relaxed lifestyle. The weather was nice. So I enjoyed my time there overall, other than the WWC Puerto Rico financial stress when they weren't being totally honest about their pay. But the IWA was all positive. But I was IWA Intercontinental Champion, which I beat Ricky Banderas, for Mil Mortes, and I was two-time WWC Puerto Rico tag team champions with Black Pain, who I think he's known as Monster Pain now, but we were a very good tag team. He later got signed by WWE, but for whatever reason, at one point they were going to introduce him, John Moxley, and someone else as a group, apparently, that was going to feud with The Undertaker back around 2007, 2008-ish, I believe, from what the rumors was. But for whatever reason, John was put with the Shield or whatever, and then Black Pain and whoever the other guy was, they ended up just getting cut. But I do believe, like, because I was good at taking bumps and I moved really well and I was big, but I can talk. And we also always had managers, which the manager added a dynamic. But Black Pain was like 6'8", 400 and something pounds, and he was just a monster. So I think we worked very well together, and we could have been like a WWE tag team that was successful just because we were huge. And I think we complemented each other well. I could always feed the comeback because I was really good bumper, and he wouldn't have to take as many bumps. But because he was massive, if he ever were to bump, like, it would get a huge reaction. But we worked really well together, even though at that time he spoke no English and I spoke very little Spanish. We had a way of communicating that somehow worked.
So you've had a number of matches within the WWE umbrella, including one, I believe it was on Sunday Night Heat against Nick Dinsmore, Eugene. Can you speak of your experiences working for them on a per diem basis, or how did you end up getting booked?
I was actually used 14 times by WWE, but in those days you wouldn't always get looked at. I only got 2 matches out of those 14 times. You got paid anyways. And then at one point I went to Deep South Wrestling for a month, their development league. But for that, I had to pass a tryout. And yeah, I wrestled for them every week. And my record, I think, was 2-2, but it was like I had to pay to be there. And the training was questionable at best. But how I started getting tryouts, I was friends in Calgary with a guy named Les Thornton, who was a former NWA junior heavyweight champion. And he initially got me booked at a Calgary Calgary Raw and a Kelowna SmackDown because he just called the WWE office. And he felt I was ready from the tapes I had shown him. He didn't like the Hearts for whatever reason, but I had a mutual friend from the gym that introduced me to him. So I would go and visit with Les Thornton, and he would teach me some stuff, but he would also watch my matches. So he was the one that initially tried to get me the job. And then that was through Tom Pritchard, who now has a podcast that airs on this channel Wednesday nights. And then shortly after that, Tommy Dreamer took over from Tom Pritchard. Tommy Dreamer was the one that would send me back pretty much every time they came to Canada. He really wanted me to get a job, but in those days they weren't looking as hard. Like now, I think they really, first of all, they have the tryouts that they send people to. They now have this whole NXT Performance Center that has regular tryouts. Back then, it was OVW and Deep South Wrestling. It was way less organized. But yeah, Tommy kept sending me back. But then, unfortunately, Nova took over from Tommy Dreamer's job once Tommy Dreamer went back full-time on the roster. And then for whatever reason, Nova didn't like me. So Nova gave me no tryouts for about the year period that he was in charge of giving people tryouts. And then right when Ty Bailey took over from Nova, that's when I got another tryout and I was signed right from that one. But everybody knows the story. Unfortunately, I had caught Hep C, which was proven in court, from Abdullah the Butcher, which we didn't know until I failed the WWE's medical, and they rescinded my contract. So for everyone that says that I was never good enough to be in WWE, I actually had a WWE contract. I was actually signed before Kevin Owens, before Jinder Mahal, and I had wrestled less than Kevin Owens, less than Sami Zayn, and I was signed before those guys. I just had my contract rescinded for health reasons. And then after I got cured, they looked at me as damaged goods because in 2016, after I had been cured, Gerald Briscoe and Jim Ross had tried to get me another tryout, and I actually had an NXT tryout set up for, I think it was May of 2016 or April 2016. I actually had my itinerary and everything. And then 10 days before the tryout, they said, "We're sorry for any confusion we may have caused you, but you're no longer invited to the tryout." So it was at that point I realized that, okay, they're seeing me as damaged goods. Even though I'm cured, they're never going to give me another shot. This is where I'm just going to focus on YouTube, because obviously my wrestling career is over. So for anyone that likes to say anything that's happened in recent years, kayfabe and non-kayfabe, is the reason I was not in WWE. No. Actually, all the way back in 2009, I was hired, and the reason I was never got the contract was a health reason. I didn't pass the medical, and that's well documented. So nobody can say how good or how bad I would have done in WWE because I never got that chance. But I think it's pretty good evidence that I've never had that platform, and I'm doing pretty well on YouTube, and I'm actually known in the wrestling business. I've had Steve Austin call me. I've talked to Hulk Hogan on the phone. People know me in wrestling, and I've never made it to the big leagues. So that shows you that you have something. And as I said, I've said this recently on a podcast, the Bloodhunters matches of 2021, I don't think you'll find another independent wrestler that had more views per match than the Bloodhunter had in 2021. And then he finished out the year as the most hated heel in wrestling, getting publicity all over the world. But now I've put my whole wrestling career on the back burner, and I'm just focusing on being a reporter. I have no real interest in wrestling anymore, other than the retirement match that didn't happen this year will eventually happen.
Ivan wants to know, why did you never tour Japan? And he's saying you need the Rivera jacket, the steakhouse jacket.
I don't know why. I can only say they're afraid of me because I did pin AJ Styles twice in one night when he was New Japan Pro Wrestling Heavyweight Champion. In 2019, I did the LA Dojo for a week camp there in 2019, and at one point they had us all amateur wrestle, and I won both of my amateur wrestling matches in seconds. And in the second amateur wrestling match I had, somebody headbutted my eye and actually split my eye open. I had to get stitches and so forth. And I still won the match. I didn't give up. But for whatever reason, legitimate shooting ability doesn't matter. And for whatever reason, there's less jobs and they're looking for the smaller acrobatic guys overall these days there, or the guys that have been in the WWE. But to be honest, I don't think I would enjoy myself over there. I don't like the acrobatic style that they do there. And I really don't like traveling anymore. To be honest, I'm very happy sitting at home. I didn't I dealt with traveling to the US, but I've had very little urge to travel much in my life, particularly to be in small hotel rooms, and my passion for wrestling is not there anymore. So it's just not something I'm interested in. The days of the Sheik and Abdullah the Butcher and Stan Hansen and Vader and Bruiser Brody, those are long gone. Japanese wrestling business it's at an all-time low right now in viewership. So it's not something that like really interests me.
I think I know the answer to this one, but Richard M wants to know what your time was like at Impact Wrestling when they toured Canada.
Well, I actually brought Impact Wrestling to Canada the very first time in 2007. People don't actually, like, a lot of people don't know this, but I was the promoter of Impact Wrestling's very first Canadian tour. They went to Montreal, Quebec City, and Hull, Quebec, but they were not very fun to work with. For instance, they didn't want to use PCO or Sylvain Grenier on the cards. They'd rather bring in like low-level American. They had good crowds, by the way. At that time, they were averaging 800 and under in the US, and all of the events were well over 1,000 for that TNA Quebec tour. But like, it would have been so much easier to put like Sylvain Grenier and PCO in there, for instance, against established TNA wrestlers. That would have drawn more in Quebec than nobody wrestlers. But they said they had a policy against bringing in outside wrestlers. But both PCO and Sylvain Grenier were doing French commentary for Impact. So it's not like they were not connected. And then they wouldn't mention the shows on their Impact Wrestling broadcasts. So we ended up doing all right. I wrestled Abyss on the event in Hull. But again, because I was not part of TNA, eventually, I think a day or two before, they they finally let me have a story to say I was going to wrestle Abyss in the newspaper, because in Ottawa, I am probably this isn't saying much, but I'm the most known wrestler ever from Ottawa, who has not really produced any famous wrestlers. So it would have been a big deal to all the way through promote me as fighting Abyss. But they only let me do it a couple days before, when I told them, hey, there's a big newspaper that's only going to give a story if it's me versus Abyss, because I'm local. And finally they let me. And we did have a good crowd for that at the Robert Gritty Arena, but it was a pain. And then they used me again, and I think it was 2017, which I really regret helping them with that. They had contacted me, asked me to help them with promoting advice for the Ottawa area, because for some reason they randomly put on an event here. They came to a Great North Wrestling event, gave out free tickets. Then I helped get them all sorts of stories on the night they were going to allow me to wrestle, which, by the way, they were in Ottawa, I think 6 total nights. And the second highest crowd, other than the Bound for Glory, was the night I wrestled, because I was able to do all this extra publicity. Then they had me lose. So first of all, they had me be a bad guy and lose as a bad guy in the local town. And it's like, they've never been back since. It's like, why do that to someone that actually used his contacts to help promote your show, and then you have me lose just to disappoint the crowd, and then have me come out as a bad guy when I've been promoted as the local guy? It made absolutely no sense. But that company is faded into the oblivion. They recently had only 125 people at a taping. So I don't know. I just felt betrayed on that. They also give me a code that they said if I advertised and told people to use this code to buy tickets, that I would get a percentage. And I know for one thing, 100% one person bought 10 tickets just to see me wrestle using that code. And I didn't see a penny from that code that they gave me. And in other companies I've talked to where they've done similar things, where they've given companies codes where they're supposedly going to get a percentage for helping Impact sell tickets, no one I've talked to have actually got anything from these codes. So there's some shady stuff that goes on with these people.
Mike D wants to know, and thank you for the $2, that are you more of a Dino Bravo or Rick Martel fan? Interesting question there.
I was never really a fan of each, but speaking of Rick Martel, I will tell you a Rick Martel story. Here is the other funny thing. As I was telling you about what a pain in the ass TNA was, as far as letting me promote, Rick Martel, because it was in the Colisée de Quebec City, the TNA show that I presented there, actually contacted me and told me he wanted to be part of this TNA show. And they would not give any confirmation about Rick Martel being part of this, even though he's like the biggest star wrestler ever from Quebec City. And they would not put him in the advertising, and they would not give me an answer on whether Rick Martel could be part of the show or not. Then the night of the show, they let Rick Martel be part of one of the finishes in a match unadvertised. So it's like it would have been, I can't remember the last time Rick Martel had done something on a WWE show at the Colisée in Quebec City. And this would have been like a perfect opportunity to sell a crap load more tickets. But they refused to advertise that Rick Martel was going to be there. But in my meeting with him, he was very friendly. But I remember him talking to me. We were sitting in the hockey players' bench watching the first part of the show before he went on, and he's like, "Why didn't they say I was going to be here?" And I'm like, "It wasn't up to me. I was just a local promoter, but I didn't have final say on who advertised."
Brutal. Moving over to your tenure as the person who commenced Great North Wrestling. Can you talk about how that came about and some of your experiences that may be notable as a promoter were?
With Great North Wrestling, basically, as I said, in Puerto Rico, the second company I worked for, WWC Puerto Rico, wasn't honest with their pay, and at one point, I just couldn't survive out there not getting paid. So I decided to return to Canada. But by that point, Stu Hart had died, and there wasn't much going on in Calgary for wrestling. They had sold the Hart House, so there was no dungeon or anything. And there was a lot of the family itself. There was fighting within the family, and it just wasn't a good time. I think by this time, Harry and TJ were also already in WWE with Natty. So the independent scene was like at a low. So I decided, okay, well, there's no reason for me to stay in Calgary anymore, because by this time I had broken up with the girl I was living with in Alberta. So it was like, I'm going to go back to Ontario. But at that time, there also wasn't all that much going on in Ontario. So I figured, since I think I already mentioned I was already promoting Stampede wrestling matches here and there, that I would just start promoting my own events. So that's what I did. That's why I started Great North Wrestling. The very first Great North Wrestling event had over 4,000 fans at the Ottawa Civic Center, the same Ottawa Civic Center where I saw Ric Flair debut. So that was scratching a big thing off my bucket list in the wrestling in that arena where I used to watch WWE. Just like for TNA, at least on that Quebec tour, I got to wrestle in Robert Goethe Arena in Hull, where I'd also seen WWE as a kid. I wrestled there one more time for Jacques Rougeau in later years. But, you know, when you're a kid growing up watching WWE in certain arenas, that's like your Madison Square Garden. So to be able to walk out the same aisle, walk down the same aisle that you used to watch the wrestlers walk down when you were a kid, that's a pretty cool thing. Oh, I think your sound isn't. I don't know if I heard your sound, but I saw it pop up. Who's my favorite opponent? I don't really have a favorite opponent, to be honest with you. I guess overall in IWA Puerto Rico, when I was feuding with Ricky Banderas, I wrestled him a lot over the course of the year I wrestled for them. And we had big, huge crowds, and we're main eventing. So I would say I had the most success as a draw against Ricky Banderas. Obviously, my matches with Abdullah always drew well. That became an outside the ring feud. For a local person, Jeremy Prophet, him and I always had very good matches together. So as far as having like the best matches, I would say it was with him. And he recently had the very first AEW match ever in Canada this past Wednesday in Toronto. And for some reason, I'm not hearing your audio. Strange. Let me take you out and put you back in. Let's try this again. Can you say something just so I can see if I can hear you? Can you hear me? Maybe try exiting and coming back in. Otherwise, I don't know what's happening. But in the meantime, I'll answer this question. Bill says, now that management had changed in WWE, would I consider lacing up the boots again? It's still Vince McMahon that's the owner. He's the majority stockholder in WWE. Triple H has his guys that he's bringing back, even the guys that have done nothing since they've been released. And I'm certainly not considered a Triple H guy, and my style of wrestling is not suitable for WWE. The only way I could ever see WWE being interested in me is if this channel ever had like 5 million subscribers and my popularity outweighed any of the personal issues that they might have against me. But right now I don't see, I would be miserable there, and also I don't see them having any interest in me. I'm just not their style of wrestler. I would have been back when I was younger, but now I'm not. And it's very strange that hold on. For some reason, I'm not getting any audio from Jack. It's very, very strange. Huh. It's very, very strange. Say something now if you can. Huh. It's very, very strange. Say something now if you can. Huh. It's very, very strange. No, now I'm just getting an echo of myself. I'll answer some of these questions since I can't hear Jack. Jack, try exiting and re-entering StreamYard if you can. That might do it. Thoughts on the Mountie backstage at AEW? I think they're silly that they didn't use him. That would have got a big pop. Maybe they did, and I just didn't hear about it. But to have him backstage and not use him on camera seems like a waste. So we'll see if we can get Jack's audio. I don't know if you guys could hear him, but I couldn't hear him at all. I'll answer some other questions. Andrew, yeah, I did answer this at the start. I was involved in Matt Rat's. I think why it ultimately didn't get off the ground because the main guy funding it was a drug smuggler named Graham Owens, who ended up doing prison time. I guess he was a pilot and he was smuggling drugs. So I guess that's the main reason why it never happened. He was caught. So I guess that was the issue. Bill says he could not hear him either. Okay, so Jack, they couldn't hear you either. Can you hear us now? Matthew, yeah, he did an interview with Trisha Morrison the other night that I think had something like 6,000 or 7,000 on Facebook. I was supposed to do that interview, but I was having audio issues that night. But this night, it seems like for whatever reason, we can't hear Jack, which is one of the issues with being live. I'll see if there's any after my retirement match, what will happen with Great North Wrestling. I have passed it on to Jack. I have no interest in promoting wrestling anymore. I'm not a wrestling fan, and I don't want to spend my time on it. So Jack is doing this. He will be promoting Great North Wrestling next year. We're still gonna air it on the Hannibal TV, and I'll still help him with stuff because I want him to be a success. But I have my own stuff that is less stressful. Promoting is very stressful and time consuming, and for someone that might be going into retirement, that's one thing. But I still have to like earn a living at regular jobs and stuff. Mike, will there ever be a Nails interview? Yeah. At some point there will, if I ever get down to Minnesota. It's too bad. I think we can hear some background noise from you, Jack. Can you say something?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Okay, now we can hear you.
Okay. Technical difficulties, all apologies.
That's
so
what
we're
happens when we
on
go
the
live.
topic of Great North Wrestling. I'm too loud now?
No, I was saying that's just one of the things about going live. Sometimes you run into these, but at least we can have the fan interaction.
Absolutely. Wanted to pick up on the Great North Wrestling question that you had explained how it sort of came about. And I know on YouTube and on the Hannibal TV, there are, numerous very memorable matches, angles, situations. Do you have any that jump out at first consideration that would go down as your most enjoyable?
Well, of course, the Terry Funk thing in Thunder Bay. I really enjoyed that because I've already talked to you a little bit about Thunder Bay. We went there twice. The first time we had something like 1,800 fans. The second time we had over 3,000 fans. And that was a town that WWE used to come to. But it's way, way, way out in the woods for any of you Americans watching that have no idea where it is. It's in the middle of nowhere, up in the forest. You got to drive for hours in woods to find it. And to fly in Americans, they all pretty much have to come in the day before because it causes a lot of connection flights. But I remember we had to fly Terry Funk in the day before, and he had agreed to do the press conference. And there was so much cost involved in that show. We knew we had to do something intense for the press conference. So he actually helped me put together this whole incident that we did in the hotel before the day before the show. And we only had around 2,000 tickets sold at that time. And from that thing at the hotel, it made the front page of the newspaper. It made both channels of news that night. And there was local media that had filmed it and picked up on it. Plus, the Hannibal TV didn't exist then, but it was on other YouTube channels that we worked with. And it was like the talk of the wrestling business. And we ended up selling like over 1,000 tickets between that press conference and the show. And the press conference was so real that there was actually fans that were just sitting there watching the press conference that like came in to separate Terry and I. And then the next night to wrestle Kevin Nash, who's one of the all-time greats and one of my favorites growing up, in front of a crowd like that was amazing. But I remember when at that time Terry had hit me with the picture frame, so my face was scratched. And Terry had taken those brutal slaps, so his face was all messed up. And I remember Kevin Nash, who at the time was filming that stripper movie, Magic Mike, in Minnesota. And there was some issue where he was going to drive from Minnesota to Thunder Bay, which was like a 15-hour drive, I think, from Minneapolis to Thunder Bay straight up. And he was so tired when he got there. He was like, he left me a message and it almost sounded like he had just been in the forest so long. It sounded like he had almost like was losing his mind. And he asked if he could show up late since we were going to be last and sleep for longer in his hotel. And I said, yeah, fine. And then I just remember he showed up and he looks at Terry, whose face is all screwed up, and he looks at me with my scratches on my face from getting cut with the picture frame. He's like, we're not doing that, are we? Are we? I'm like, no, we got our heat already yesterday. We don't have to do anything. And we had incredible heat for that show. The crowd was going nuts. So that I think was my fondest memory because I'm a huge fan of Terry Funk and Kevin Nash. And there was another funny incident. I actually got in a bar fight later that night that was completely my fault. And here's a funny thing about it. Terry was drinking with Honky Tonk Man at another bar. And I was at this other bar. And because Honky and Terry were faces, the heels were at this other bar. We were kind of kayfabing, but the bars were about to close. And I had convinced the bartenders to let me order more alcohol, and we could stay after since we were wrestlers to like continue drinking after the bar. So Terry and Honky were going to come and continue drinking with us. And I remember Honky told me that he had told Terry before they left, maybe we shouldn't come here. Devin can get a little out of hand sometimes if there's alcohol involved. And Terry's like, no, come on, let's go. And then Honky says as they pull up, there's like 4 or 5 police cars with like sirens at the front of the bar. And like it was all something that I had started. But luckily, I remember they still gave us like a case of beer and let us take it back to the hotel. And we celebrated. Like, how many times are you going to get 3,000 fans for like a non WWE show? And there was so much stress going into that we had to blow off steam. And no, I do say that it was my fault, but this guy was being rough with his girlfriend. And basically, I was coming out of the bathroom and saw it and just knocked the guy out. So it was my fault. He wasn't causing a fight with me, but he did deserve what he got.
A good Samaritan, if you will. Wanted to ask you about the Bloodhunter character, and you touched on that earlier about the fact that the character was the talk of the wrestling business, and the number one heel in the business in actuality for that period of time. How did you develop the Bloodhunter character? Where did that inspiration come from?
It basically, the inspiration just came from my ex-wife had been doing my makeup for Hannibal, and she was getting sick of doing my makeup, and I didn't know how to do my own makeup. And I did try it one infamous time, and I completely failed, and it got me a lot of heat. So we decided, okay, I'm not going to do my own makeup, and you don't want to do it anymore. So I'm just going to wear a mask. So I started the first time was against Ted Hart, just wearing the mask to wrestle. And we weren't even really saying it was anyone but Hannibal that time. But the character had such a crazy reaction from the fans in attendance. Then when we put it on YouTube, it had like over 10,000 hits in a short amount of time. They were like, okay, maybe we should make something out of this character and not just have it be Hannibal in a mask. And the Bloodhunter, I would say, other than Hannibal in Puerto Rico, the Bloodhunter became more famous than Hannibal was as a wrestler in the less than 2 years that he wrestled. And the potential for the Bloodhunter was unlimited, but he was a wild and crazy character that a lot of big time wrestlers and wrestling legends were fans of, like Kevin Sullivan and Billy Graham, for instance, really loved the Bloodhunter character. Tom Pritchard had told me that he really loved the Bloodhunter character. And he got really, really popular in Texas. Even there still is going to be a movie made about him at one point, but it's going to be a fictional movie. But it's too bad the Bloodhunter never really reached its potential. But to answer your question, no, it just kind of happened, and then we went with it. And it was an interesting character, a fun character, but a painful character to play because all of his matches were very realistic. And I think I got my most concussions as the Bloodhunter, as well as a torn chest and a lot of other aches and pains. People kind of like always forget that yes, the Bloodhunter takes a lot of punishment too. But yeah, it was another chapter in my career showing that I could be a different character. And up until the point where everyone decided to expose the Bloodhunter, a lot of people didn't even know the Bloodhunter was me. So I thought that was pretty cool.
So the Bloodhunter does remain the Great North Wrestling heavyweight champion, and one of the matches that the fans were really looking forward to was the main event at Petawawa against Jeremy Prophet, who you mentioned earlier, who recently was, well, actually on Wednesday, I believe, was on the AEW show in Toronto. Do you see that match happening in the future, or where do you see your? I know you're indicating that you're mostly out of in-ring action, but where do you see that piece of unfinished business going in 2023?
I am indicating that I'm mostly out of in-ring action, but at the same time, there is a wrestling scene for the Bloodhunter movie that was supposed to be recorded at that event that was canceled despite a very good advance, and it was just a horrible situation that sadly cost me a lot of money, and like everybody was disappointed and nobody's more disappointed about that whole situation than me. But I really don't see the Bloodhunter having more than another match unless something great changes, another match and something where he can record the stuff for the movie, because I wanted to retire by the time I was 40. Well, that didn't happen. Now I am 40, so I am going to have the one more match. It will likely be in the spring, I guess, of next year, the way things are looking. Perhaps in Ottawa. I guess we'll see how the final booking goes, but maybe it'll be more fitting that the Bloodhunter actually has his final match in Ottawa, where, as I said, I am the most. Up until this point, no one from Ottawa has made WWE or become as known as a wrestler as I have. So I think if I will call it a career, it might be best to have that final match in Ottawa. Will it be against Jeremy? Only time will tell. I seriously hope he gets that AEW contract. He deserves it. But wrestling is very political. As I recently mentioned, they hired back Stu Grayson recently, who did nothing of significance in the time he wasn't employed by them. And in my opinion, Jeremy Prophet is incomparably better than Stu Grayson. So I don't know why Jeremy wouldn't get a chance. He is training with QT Marshall right now. I hope that he gets I hope he gets a shot. And I know AEW does let their talent sometimes work indies. So maybe in the best case scenario, he'll still be able to work for Great North Wrestling. But I guess only time will tell, because as of right now, we're not exactly sure when the first event in 2023 will be. I guess likely April, the way things are looking. But who knows? I guess we'll know more in the coming months.
Well, the hour has just flown by, Hannibal. Happy 40th birthday! And do you have any final words for your expansive audience and fans out there?
Just thank you for supporting me on this channel. As I recently said, actually in a therapy session, because I am going through a therapy to try and become a better person. As we get older, we always try and improve ourselves. And at one point in time, I was so focused on my life will be over if I don't become a WWE wrestler. And my whole life, there was nothing but becoming a WWE wrestler. But now I am very satisfied and happy in my life being a reporter, working in the wrestling business like this, talking with legends, having these great fans to talk with that I do consider you guys my friends. And like I'm very content with this. So I'm happy that this way of making a living has come into an existence where when I was 20 years old, this didn't exist. When I was 30 years old, this was only just starting to. And luckily, I'm actually, I believe, the first person to legitimately put free shoot interviews out on the internet. Before it was only pirated ones. So I am one of the innovators, and I just thank you guys for letting me do this for a living. And thank you for doing this podcast and taking over Great North Wrestling. So Great North Wrestling won't die, because as I said, I have other things that I enjoy more than promoting and wrestling now. So thank you, Jack, for that. And I appreciate everyone that subscribes to the Hannibal TV. We're almost at 340,000 subscribers. So if you are not subscribed, please subscribe. And that's about it. Thank you very much. And I think you have Ted Hart coming up again in another couple of weeks on this Great North Wrestling podcast. Oh, we've lost your sound again. We've lost your sound again.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can. Okay.
Wow, this has been a challenge. It's actually been the first technical morass that I've had. But yes, Ted Hart is booked for a return on October the 30th. We're going to be doing a deep dive into his career. And next week, going to be having a personal friend of mine who worked for Al Tomko's promotion, All-Star Wrestling in BC, Portland, and WWE Enhancement Work, the great Doug Casson, who will be on to talk about his career and how he balanced a very interesting career in federal corrections and pro wrestling. So until then, thanks very much, everyone, for watching, and happy birthday, Hannibal.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and click the subscribe button to not miss any of our latest shoot interviews, match videos, or news updates. Follow us on Twitter at the Hannibal TV for instant